We continue in 2 Samuel 18 today as we come near the end of this long narrative from 2 Samuel 15 to 18 of Absalom's rebellion. And after all the buildup of counsel and advice and double-crossing and movement, suddenly the battle happens in just a couple of verses and Absalom will find himself hung in a tree by his head. So before we enter it, just a few things to get us oriented for where we are. If you haven't been watching these videos, I encourage you to watch the introductory video to this unit, where I go over these things on the right side of the screen, including many of these style elements that we'll see today, including the use of the infinitive absolute many times in our immediate passage for emphasis, and the various interpretive options, especially around the character of David that we read throughout this, although this immediate scene does not involve David at all directly. And then the shape that we've been looking at, and we've got through these scenes, and now we're into the battle ensuing, and spoiler alert, Israel's defeated and Absalom will be killed and buried. But that's hardly the main point of it. The main point of it, among other things, is the relationship between personal realities and political realities and God realities, which to say, does David maintaining power or any king maintaining power mean the sacrifice of his sons? Did Yahweh want that? Did David want that? Or is it just Joab's idea? Or is it the people's idea? We have to try to sort that out if we're going to make sense of why this story is written in the amount of detail it is, in contrast to almost all the other monarchy stories for the next hundreds of years, which are just sketched out in the broadest of strokes. So, as we've been looking at where we are, David was in Mahanaim and Absalom's troops just crossed the Jordan River here. And yet, as we'll see in a moment, it's going to take place in the forest, and we'll look at the picture in a moment just to see what kind of forest it is. Not the kind of forest I have here in the Pacific Northwest with big conifer trees, as you'll see. We've also been looking at the characters and places, and today we'll meet an anonymous man who finds Absalom hanging from a tree. And we don't even know which side that man's on. I put him in purple because he informs Joab. But is he one of Absalom's people or one of David's people? It's not 100% clear, although the text gives a hint that Absalom finds himself by accident among David's people and separated from his own people. Another thing we're going to look at here are the very interesting parallels between chapter 2 in 2 Samuel and chapter 18. As you can see there on the right side of the screen, they're both framed by Mahanaim, which, as we've looked at, is not much elsewhere throughout 2 Samuel. We see it here in the scene in 2 Samuel, framing what I was just mentioning. Then we saw it here in chapter 9, and now we had it immediately in our scene in chapter 17. So the parallels with Mahanaim are certainly not a coincidence. And in both of them, the people who die get their heads are involved in the battle around the pool. Each grabs his opponent by the head, and of course Absalom's head will get caught fast in the oak or the terebinth, as I'll show a translation of it. And in both of them, the men of Israel were beaten by the servants of David, almost identically. And although this is defeated, we'll see that it really means struck. It doesn't suggest defeated in the first verse, but certainly in both of them, Israel ends up defeated by the servants of David, not by Judah, but just by David's personal people, which highlights it throughout 2 Samuel. Although David is made king over Judah, it's really the personal individuals, as we see here in the purple, including the Cherethites and Pelethites as mercenaries and the 600 Gittites, who are not Judahites, and yet are on David's side. Then we hear the word for eating or devouring about killing in both of them. Abner calling to Joab is a sword to keep devouring forever. And the narrator tells us that the forest devoured more victims that day than the sword. And finally, almost identically again, Joab sounded the trumpet and all the people stopped. They no longer pursued Israel. And almost identical there. So what we see in those parallels is that throughout the time of David's reign, from the minute that he was dealing with Saul, the remnant of Saul's people represented by Abner and all the young men of Israel's side that were on the other side of the pool from David's men, that Saul and Israel have never fully agreed to be under David. The thought of a united monarchy is a myth. There's not ever really been a united monarchy in the sense that the people of Israel and the people of Judah are both happy to have a king in Jerusalem that they serve. We see no evidence here that the people of Israel were doing anything in accepting David back in chapter 5 other than recognizing that Saul was dead and Abner was dead, and what were they going to do? So it was only in that emergency expedient being outpowered that we see that Israel's a part of it. So although Absalom is not the man to save Israel from the injustice coming from Jerusalem, that need is still there and it will arise again in the next generation. And that's certainly something that the text is hinting at here. So as we move to our immediate text, we see this large chiasm for this unit here. We won't be able to get through all of that today, but you see at the beginning, Israel is struck, matched by Israel fled to their tents at the end. The issue of the forest in both the beginning and the end, and only there. And the question of the 1,000 is here, although that's not a part of the parallel. 1,000 is one of the key words in the unit. Then in the B parts, we hear that it's largely about Absalom and the terebinth, and then the discussion with Joab and the anonymous young man about what to do about Absalom hanging in the tree. And we noted that this chiasm follows the previous one up here, and the only verse that wasn't in the chiasm was the king saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man, Absalom," which the anonymous man will quote, but he'll misquote it. He'll quote it a little differently, as we'll see. Then the last part will also be its own big chiasm of the competition to bring the news to David, whether we think it's good news or not, whether they think it's good news or not, we'll have to see. That the death of Absalom, the death of his enemy, the death of the rebel king, whether that's good news to David, good news to the people of Judah, we'll find out pretty soon. So, beginning with our passage here in verse 6, and as I've been saying throughout this situation, the people of David are never the army, they're always the people. And interestingly, the people of Absalom are always an army, even though they're more like the people of Israel, and David's people are more like a miscellaneous collection of people that are being paid or patrons or those kinds of people. So they're really not a people, they're various ethnic groups, so we see no particular connection with them other than David as the central magnetic force that draws them together. So the people went out into the field, and we noted a couple of videos ago about the role of field in this sequence, and so I would encourage you to look at that if you haven't. As my note below has, contrast from Falkman, contrasting with the constricted forest or scrub that we see for the word here for forest. As the Brown Drive Briggs lexicon suggests, a thicket or scrub more than a forest. And if you look at this Google map, although it's described as the forest of Ephraim, which would be on the other side of the Jordan where the territory of Ephraim is, and we're plainly on the Transjordanian side outside of Mahanaim, we can see this tree, I want to say forested, but it's not really forested from my point of view, at least this tree-covered or at least tree-interspersed hillside, which makes sense that there's enough space between them that horses and soldiers could get between them and also hide in there. So that's the scene we should picture here. And what's interesting, too, is that when I was looking for pictures to illustrate this, almost all the classic art of Absalom and the tree has him riding a horse, but the text emphasizes a mule, as we'll see in just a minute, and that's no small detail. Amazing how many artists seem to miss that point. So we continue here. The men of Israel were not defeated, were struck, and that's important because it's not over here. They're being attacked, but the battle's not over, as we see in verse 8. So if they were defeated in verse 7, this would be a summary of what's happening rather than an introduction to what's unfolding. And as readers, we would not know the outcome quite yet. It would just mean they were struck. And the slaughter is great. But as it says, the slaughter is great in that day, 20,000 men, but it doesn't say how many for each side. It certainly doesn't say those are all the Israelites. But the idea of 20,000 certainly echoes David is killed as tens of thousands that we saw back in 1 Samuel 18:7 and elsewhere that so angered Saul in his jealousy. So the slaughter was great, 20,000. So one of the questions we need to ask, too, as I've been asking all along in relation to these interpretive options, if we take that this is all happening as a fulfillment of Yahweh's word that came to David via Nathan back in chapter 12, that I will take your women or your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. And the whole rebellion is Yahweh's will. Well, is it Yahweh's will that 20,000 people die to make a point about David and Uriah and Bathsheba? As I was noting earlier, though, if we interpret this narrowly on what it just says, all it would say that would happen as a result of the prophecy is that Absalom would go into the concubines in front of everybody, which is exactly what happened. But maybe the rest of this isn't Yahweh's will at all. And we have to decide that as we go. Is this happening to punish David? Is it happening to punish Absalom, as we heard a little bit earlier from the narrator, that Hushai confused the counsel of Ahithophel so that Absalom would go the wrong way? In the end, as we'll see, Absalom is not doing what Hushai told him to do, and he's going to die anyway. So that part is all very mixed up, and it's difficult to sort out, but we'll look at it more as we continue. So now the battle spread, or literally scattered, or burst out, using the word peretz, from the child named Peretz, meaning to spread out when a pregnancy burst open into a childbirth. And so it's not so much it spread as it burst out over the face of all the land. One of the rare cases where New RSV actually leaves in the body part. As I've been noting throughout, it so often leaves out faces, hands, eyes, feet, and other body parts that the Hebrew highlights to make it incarnate and not abstract. But here it has, ironically, a metaphorical use of it, not a literal one, the face of the land. And the forest not claimed, but ate or devoured more victims that day than the sword. What is that highlighting? How would people die in the forest? Is it suggesting that they're caught like Absalom and just die there? When Absalom's caught, it's going to take a couple of acts to actually kill him. So it's not clear exactly what that means, that the forest ate more victims and how people would die just riding through the forest. But that's what we hear there. So then by chance, Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, or as I have on the right side, chanced to be in front of David's slaves. Notice he's not with his own people, that we'll see in just a minute have gone on. So contrary to the advice of Hushai that Absalom should ride in the midst of the people, for reasons we don't know, he's out there by himself and meeting his end. He's not going to meet them, he just happens to be in front of them. And he's riding on his mule, and that's key here. Even though, as I was noting, art often has horses. It's not the horses and chariots he started with in 15:1, which anticipates what we hear in Deuteronomy 17:14 to 20, mostly about Solomon, but not gathering horses, and especially not getting Egyptian horses. But we'll get to that when we get to Solomon. But we saw the mule back in 13:29. Let's look at that just briefly, where his brothers and half-brothers each mounted their mule and fled as royal sons. They were going to a sheep shearing event. They were not expecting to become kings, and they certainly were competitors with Absalom for rebelling against their father. But for reasons we don't know, they're riding on mules. Is it meant to be a royal animal? We don't know. Jim Perkison has done great work just recently on mules and donkeys, and noting if we take Leviticus 19:19 as live at the time, which is a questionable thing. Leviticus 19, like all of it, Leviticus is almost certainly an exilic text, and if what we're reading in 2 Samuel is about the succession itself, it would be several centuries earlier. But perhaps the rule would still have applied. As you can see from Leviticus 19:19, you shall not let your animals breed with a different kind, which is how you get a mule, from crossbreeding between a horse and a donkey. We saw that Saul was on donkeys, and what Ferguson notes is that mules replaced donkeys as royal steeds around this time as elite imports, because if the Israelites can't make mules, they have to import them, and that would make them expensive. And Perkinson also knows they've been pack animals for the Egyptians in the Sinai since 2100 BCE, so at least for a millennium before this. So in that sense, if mules were associated with Egypt, and David is going to be on a mule, was on a mule, and Solomon's going to be on a mule, that would highlight some of the Egyptian element. And Perkinson notes that Jesus going on a donkey might be subversive of or mocking of that very issue here, but we'll have to get to that when we get to that in the Gospels. So he was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a terebinth. Not sure why it's translated as oak, but a terebinth is a key tree in the Bible, and although it's not a key word throughout, I highlighted it here on the right side because it's 4 times in the immediate scene. And like so many things in this Absalom story, the only echo, like Mahanaim, is into Genesis. Here, a terebinth back in Genesis 35, although there are other terebinths in Genesis as well, including the one that Abraham and Sarai are under when the visitors come. His head caught fast in the oak. Not his hair, although my note says it's the hair that betrays him. The text doesn't actually say that. The implication is that his hair gets tangled and that gets his head caught, but it's interesting that it doesn't mention that in particular. That it got fast in the oak, literally that it grew strong or was seized. Ironically, recalling 15:5 and 16:21, let's look back at those. Here, Absalom, as he began, put out his hand to take hold of them, which is to say seize them. So he was putting out his hand to seize people, to get them to be part of his coalition, and the tree put out its branches, so to speak, and caught him there to get rid of that. And then we also saw that in 16:21, when Ahithophel says here, the hands of all you are with will be strengthened. So in that sense of strengthened here, Echoing both those situations. And yet, as my note continues below, Ahithophel's death was planned and organized, while Absalom's is plainly accidental and chaotic. And he was left hanging, but not hanging. Although that's a powerful, evocative image, the Hebrew doesn't say that. The only time it says hanging is in the next verse 10. So what we see here is his head caught fast in the terebinth, and he was given between heaven and earth. And Midrash and others have done a lot on the between heaven and earth, including the idea that, as my note below has, that his life and persona are caught hanging once the rebel, rising high, now comes down to earth and becomes once again a son once he's cut down. But for the moment, he's in this liminal space between the two. And then we hear that out of nowhere a man saw it, and we realize we don't know what the scene is here. Absalom's meeting the servants of David. We don't know if that's a handful of people or his whole organized group here, not an army, but his organized group. If so, why are they not battling Absalom's army, the Israelites, which we'll hear in a few verses will continue elsewhere. So the man saw it and told Joab, and we don't know if he had to go somewhere else to tell Joab. Presumably Joab's not right there, or he wouldn't need this man to tell him. So this man is at the terebinth, knows where Joab is, and finds him somewhere else and says, I saw Joab hanging in an oak or a terebinth, and as always, the NRSV leaves out Hannah, behold, which is both in his mouth and then in Joab's mouth in response. And Joab said to the man who told him, Behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. Literally, shekel here. I'm sorry, not shekel there. It's shekel when he responds in the next verse as weight. So for Joab offers him 10 pieces of silver and a belt. That sounds curious to us, but a hagora there, and it becomes symbolic because we'll see in 1 Kings 2:5 when David gives Solomon assassination orders for Joab, we're told that he put the blood of war on his belt. So it'll be Joab's belt as at issue. This man, of course, doesn't get this theoretical belt. But the man said to Joab, and it's really quite a speech to say to someone as dangerous as Joab, but he's caught in a bind. And one can ask, is he caught in the same kind of bind that the authors are in? Is this really the voice of the authors, what to do about the death of Absalom? So let's listen to what he says. Even if I felt in my hand, or if you look on the right side, you can see, even if I felt in my palm the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver. And the word for weight here is shekel. The only other use for it in Samuel is at 14:26, when we heard that Absalom's hair at the annual haircut weighed 200 shekels. So there as a weight and here as a weight, sometimes simply as a unit of money, representing a piece of silver as a unit of money. But here it's not that, it's to highlight the shekel, the contrast between the 200 shekels worth of his hair, now some portion of that in the tree, and the offer of not just 10 pieces of silver, but 1,000 pieces. I would still not raise my hand against the king's son. Notice this is not against Yahweh's anointed, where David, back in 1 Samuel 24 and 26, twice told Saul, I would dare not to raise my hand before the Lord's anointed. This is not the Lord's anointed, and the king's son is not necessarily going to become the Lord's anointed. Certainly this one isn't, because he's dead. But are any of these sons, including Solomon, Yahweh's anointed? Or are this just the king that the people chose? We'll find that out soon enough. For in our hearing, or literally in our ears, another body part the New RSV leaves out, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, notice he was listening, we were told all the people heard, for my sake, this says, protect or watch over the young man Absalom. But what we really heard was do gently to the young man. The word for watch over is what David said he was leaving the concubines for, to watch over the house. But he's not done yet, because that's one issue there. If he's going to violate the king, David, and obey Joab to not protect the young man, but he continues. As Falkman notes, the soldier parallels Uriah in refusing an order perceived as immoral and draws a causal sequence between the act and this one. Quote, the inner logic of David's negative karma leads to Absalom, himself a murderer, as the victim, and to Joab as the executioner. So, on the other hand, which is not in the Hebrew, as you can see on the right side of the screen, he just continues. If I had dealt treacherously, or as my note below has, Falkman, the only word containing a value judgment in the long speech, meaning if I had made deceit against his life, And this is doubled here, as we can see over on the right side again. And there is nothing hidden from the king, noting that whether through Joab or other messengers, everything gets back to him. That echoes into Ecclesiastes, when in a much different time it's recognized that the king has ears everywhere, as you can see here. Then you yourself would have stood apart. As Halberstall and Holmes note, from a political perspective, the straightforward words of this low-ranking man should serve as a warning to generations of military subordinates who might otherwise innocently believe in the backing they will receive from their deniability-seeking supervisors when the time of reckoning comes. And you would have stood aloof, or literally stood opposite, as you can see on the right side of the screen. Absalom's going to have nothing to do with this, and as my note here has, perhaps Joab is motivated by memory of David's words of the death of Uriah. I will not waste time like this, or literally, I will thus not wait before your faces. And he took 3 spears in his hand, or 3 sticks and darts, as Falcom notes, something less than a spear. Is it one for each of the triumvirate, himself and Abishai and Ittai? Or is it one for each of the spears Saul tried to thrust at David? As Alter suggests below, it seems probable that Joab's intention is not to kill the prince, but rather to stun him and hurt him badly, and then to spread the responsibility. And that may be. And the New RSV has thrust here, but it's playing on with sounded in verse 16, which will be about the trumpet. So I chose blasted, and interestingly, Bodner, as in his book on this story, translates it the same way. So he blasted them in the heart of Absalom, as Joab will momentarily blast the trumpet, while he was still alive in the terebinth. And we'll leave it there to see what happens with Absalom hanging from the tree with 3 darts blasted into his side. We'll see you next time for that. Bye-bye.